January 27th, 1986, the night before the Challenger launch. Roger Boisjoly is on a conference call that has been going on for hours. He is an engineer at Morton Thiokol, a company that manufactures the O-rings that seal the joints of the space shuttle's solid rocket boosters. He has been trying to stop the launch schedule for the next morning. He has been arguing, presenting data, almost pleading with the decision makers on the other end of the line. The temperature at Cape Canaveral tomorrow will be 29 degrees Fahrenheit, below 0 Celsius. The coldest launch attempt in shuttle history by a wide margin. Boisjoly knows exactly what cold does to rubber O-rings. He has been documenting it for years. He loses the argument at around midnight. The launch is confirmed. He goes home. He cannot sleep. At 11:38 the next morning, 73 seconds after liftoff, the Space Shuttle Challenger breaks apart. What Boisjoly knew that nobody in the chain of command wanted to hear, and the specific words that were used to silence him the night before the disaster, is a part of this story that most people who know the Challenger disaster have never been told in full. The Space Shuttle program was, by January 1986, under extraordinary pressure. NASA had promised Congress that the shuttle would fly up to 50 missions per year. In 1985, they had managed 8. The schedule for 1986 called for 15 launches. Challenger's STS-51L mission had already been delayed multiple times, and the agency was acutely sensitive to any further postponement. On board was Krista McAuliffe, a high school teacher from New Hampshire, selected for the Teacher in Space program, the first civilian payload specialist ever approved for a shuttle flight. Her presence had turned this particular launch into a national media event. Roger Boisjoly had been watching the O-ring problem for longer than NASA wanted to acknowledge. The O-rings were the rubber seals placed at the joints where sections of the solid rocket boosters connected. Their function was simple and absolute. They had to prevent hot combustion gases from escaping through the joint. If they failed, the gases would burn through the outer casing of the rocket and reach the massive external fuel tank. The O-ring issue was not a sudden revelation. It was a creeping, documented, repeatedly acknowledged problem that the shuttle program had been managing, or failing to manage, since before the first flight. The Presidential Commission that investigated Challenger later found that NASA had received internal warnings about the O-ring erosion problem in briefings, memos, and engineering presentations going back to 1977. The problem had been classified repeatedly as acceptable risk, not because the data showed it was safe, but because previous flights had survived it, and survival in the past became the evidence base for predicting survival in the future. This reasoning, known in safety engineering as normalization of deviance, a term that the sociologist Diane Vaughan would later use in her landmark study of the Challenger disaster, is one of the most dangerous patterns in complex technical organizations. Each successful flight with O-ring erosion became evidence that O-ring erosion was compatible with mission success, rather than evidence that the shuttle was operating in a danger zone it hadn't yet escaped. The distinction was clear to engineers, like Boisjoly. It was invisible in the organizational language that management used to discuss and document the risk. As early as 1977, before the first shuttle flight, engineers had flagged the joint design as potentially problematic. Through the early 1980s, evidence of O-ring erosion, the hot gases partially burning through the seal, appeared on multiple flights. Each time the shuttle survived. Each time the engineers raised concerns, each time the decision-making process found a way to classify the erosion as within acceptable limits and proceed with the next launch. In July 1985, Boisjoly wrote a memo. It was addressed to his management at Morton Thiokol. It said explicitly and without qualification that if the O-ring erosion problem was not corrected, the company risked losing a flight crew. He used the phrase catastrophe of the highest order. The memo was received. It was filed. Management decided the concerns did not rise to the level requiring them to halt shuttle operations. The conference call that night brought together engineers and managers from both Morton Thiokol and NASA across multiple locations. Thiokol's facility in Utah, Marshall Space Flight Center in Alabama, and Kennedy Space Center in Florida. It was a teleconference, not a face-to-face meeting. And the impersonality of that format would later be cited as one of the factors that made it easier for managers to override engineers without the social friction that might have existed in the room. January 27th, 1986, the night before the launch. Temperatures at the Cape were forecast to drop into the 20s overnight. Engineers at Morton Thiokol initiated an emergency teleconference with NASA. Boisjoly and his colleague Arnie Thompson presented data showing that every erosion incident had occurred at lower temperatures. That cold temperature reduced the O-ring's ability to seal the joint. They argued the shuttles should not fly below 53 degrees Fahrenheit, the coldest previous launch temperature at which they had data. Tomorrow would be 29 degrees. They were 40 degrees outside their own data set. The dynamic in that room, the engineers arguing with data, the managers resisting with authority, became one of the most studied interactions in the history of organizational psychology and engineering ethics. The specific moment when Gerald Mason told Boisjoly and Thompson to take off your engineering hats and put on your management hats was not Mason being cruel or reckless. He was expressing in plain language the logic that NASA's schedule requirements had embedded into Morton Thiokol's decision-making culture. That the engineering uncertainty around O-ring performance in cold was not more important than the business and contractual reality of launching on time. Boisjoly later described the feeling of that moment in congressional testimony. He said he had a sickening feeling in his stomach. He said he turned to his colleague and shook his head. He said there was nothing more he could do. He signed his name to nothing that night. He refused to be part of the launch recommendation, but the company's management voted to launch without him. The NASA managers on the call pushed back hard. They challenged the data. They said the correlation wasn't convincing. One NASA official said, and these words are documented in the subsequent investigation, "My God, Thiokol, when do you want me to launch? Next April." Morton Thiokol management asked for a 5-minute break to caucus privately. That break lasted 30 minutes. During it, a senior manager named Gerald Mason turned to the engineers in the room, Boisjoly among them, and said, "Take off your engineering hats and put on your management hats." The decision was made to recommend launch over the engineers' objections. Boisjoly and Thompson argued until the very end. They were overruled. The authorization to launch was transmitted to NASA. The engineers went home. At 11:38 a.m. Eastern Time on January 28, 1986, the Space Shuttle Challenger lifted off from Launch Complex 39B. The temperature at the launch site that morning was 36 degrees, the coldest launch in shuttle history. Film footage reviewed after the accident showed a puff of dark smoke escaping from the right solid rocket booster's field joint at the moment of ignition. The O-ring seal had failed immediately, For the next 73 seconds, a thin stream of hot gas burned through the joint, eroding the seal with every passing second, held temporarily in check only by the residue of soot and burned material that was plugging the gap. 72 seconds into the flight, the Challenger rolled slightly. The seal gave way completely. Hot gas reached the external tank. A strut attaching the booster to the tank failed. The booster rotated, driving its nose into the external tank. At 73 seconds and 143 meters per second, the external tank ruptured and the orbiter was torn apart by aerodynamic forces. The crew cabin, reinforced specifically to be able to survive a breakup of the external tank, remained intact. Inside it, at least 3 of the 4 personal egress air packs were manually activated after the breakup. Someone turned them on. The crew lived for between 1 and 3 minutes after the breakup, falling from a height of 65,000 feet, before the cabin struck the ocean at over 300 kilometers per hour. In the months that followed, Roger Boisjoly testified before the Rogers Commission, the presidential investigation into the disaster. He provided his memo from July 1985. He described the teleconference in detail. He explained exactly what had been said, exactly what he had argued, exactly what the response had been. His testimony was precise, documented, and damning. Morton Thiokol responded to his cooperation with the investigation by removing him from all shuttle-related work, placing him in a position with no real responsibilities. Colleagues who had supported launch stopped speaking to him. He was, by every practical measure, punished for having told the truth to a presidential investigation about an accident that had killed 7 people. He eventually took medical leave for stress-related illness and never returned to Thiokol. When Boisjoly entered the room to testify, he brought with him copies of the memos and engineering presentations he had created before the accident. The commission members, several of whom had not yet seen the July 1985 memo predicting catastrophe, read it in session. The documentary record of what had been known, communicated, and disregarded was complete. The question was what would be done with it. The Rogers Commission, which investigated the Challenger disaster, was chaired by former Secretary of State William Rogers and included physicist Richard Feynman, astronaut Sally Ride, and test pilot Chuck Yeager. Feynman became publicly famous for his demonstration during a commission hearing in which he dropped a piece of O-ring material into a glass of ice water and showed that it had lost its elasticity. Simple, devastating evidence that the cool temperature performance of the material was exactly what Boisjoly had claimed. Feynman's appendix to the Rogers Commission report, which he insisted on including despite pressure from other commissioners who felt it was too critical of NASA, contained one of the most famous sentences in the history of engineering safety investigation. For a successful technology, reality must take precedence over public relations, for nature cannot be fooled. He spent the rest of his career speaking about engineering ethics, traveling to universities and conferences, telling the story of what happened on the night of January 27th, making sure that the words "take off your engineering hats" were never forgotten. He died in 2012. The specific failure mode he had predicted was corrected after the accident. A new joint design with a third O-ring and an improved capture feature was certified before shuttle flights resumed. The shuttle flew for another 25 years. The shuttle program returned to flight in September 1988 with the successful launch of the Discovery orbiter. The redesigned joints, the new safety review processes, the changes to launch commit criteria that gave engineers more authority to delay missions based on weather conditions, all of these were real improvements. The program flew for another 25 years, completing construction of the International Space Station and conducting numerous scientific missions. It was, by many measures, a successful continuation. The astronauts of Columbia are commemorated at the Space Mirror Memorial at the Kennedy Space Center Visitor Complex, alongside Challenger's crew and the Apollo 1 crew. The memorial is a large, polished granite slab set at an angle, with the names of the 17 NASA astronauts who have died in flight cut into the stone and backlit by natural light from behind. When sunlight falls on the memorial at certain angles, the names appear to glow. The Space Shuttle program's final mission was STS-135, flown by Atlantis in July 2011. When Atlantis landed at Kennedy Space Center at dawn on July 21, 2011, 30 years of shuttle operations ended. The program had flown 135 missions. It had launched the Hubble Space Telescope, participated in building the International Space Station, and carried hundreds of astronauts from dozens of countries to orbit. It had also killed 14 people. Challenger 7 in 1986, Columbia 7 in 2003, and disasters that both had their roots, in some measure, in institutional patterns that proved more durable than the technical fixes that followed each accident. What didn't change, what the Columbia Accident Investigation Board found to be essentially unchanged, was the organizational culture's relationship to risk normalization. The process by which known problems became acceptable through their repeated failure to cause disaster had not been structurally corrected. The specific technical problem of O-ring erosion had been addressed. The broader human problem of institutions that classify ongoing risks as acceptable because they've survived them so far had not. Roger Boisjoly had tried to warn them about both. In 2003, the Space Shuttle Columbia broke apart during re-entry, killing all 7 crew members after foam debris struck the wing during launch, and the resulting damage was not adequately investigated by NASA management. Engineers had raised concerns. Satellite imagery requests had been denied. The accident investigators noted that many of the same organizational failures identified in the Challenger investigation had not been corrected. They had just been waiting for a different mechanism to kill people. If you want to understand the disasters where the person who knew exactly what would happen said so in writing out loud the night before, subscribe. Every week, a story that was hidden in plain sight.